I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kevin Kirby. I'm a local podiatrist here, been a runner for over 40 years. And what we're going to be talking about today is running Footstrike pattern. And this is a controversial subject right now because there's many ideas about different types of foot strike, whether forefoot striking is better than rearfoot striking, which is better than midfoot striking. So the purpose of the lecture today is to review the scientific research, to show some videos of actual people in their different running forms, and to talk about the mechanics of running foot strike and how it applies to the average runner, but also the competitive and elite runner. So what is the current running foot strike controversy? First of all, we have many people who put themselves across as being experts who tend to think that rearfoot striking is evil or bad, and that all runners should be striking on their midfoot or forefoot. So having been a runner since I've been in high school, junior high, ran at UC Davis for the Aggies for 4 years, ran marathons all through first age 17 I ran my first marathon. I was running a lot of miles here in Sacramento in the 70s and 60s and 80s. I was a rearfoot striker, and many of my college athletes were rearfoot strikers. And to hear that we were somehow running wrong by these experts bothered me, and I've taken upon myself to try to do this lecture in order to try to dispel some of the common myths regarding foot strike pattern. So what is the scientific basis, if there is any, that rearfoot striking is bad, or is that a myth? Is that something that we're hearing from people who really haven't looked at the research basis behind foot strike patterns in running? So the things that I'm going to be covering today in this lecture are, number one, what is the definition of a rear foot, midfoot, and a forefoot striker? Which foot strike pattern during running is the most common? Should the feet be planted below the hip, as you commonly hear during running, that you should try to plant your foot below the hip, or should it be in front of the hip or behind the hip when you run? What foot strike pattern, rear foot, midfoot, or forefoot, is the most metabolically economical? In other words, what takes the least amount of energy to do? Which foot strike pattern takes the least amount of energy? Which foot strike pattern is the most natural? Which foot strike pattern produces more injuries? And finally, should we as runners be changing our foot strike because someone advises us that we're running the wrong way? In other words, we get into the running form. Should we be trying to change runners' form in our hope to either be less injured or run faster or to enjoy running? So first of all, let's look at the basics of the running gait cycle. Running gait is divided into two basic phases: support phase, when the foot is on the ground, and what's called the forward recovery phase. That's when the foot is swinging off the ground. Support phase is divided into foot strike. So when the heel hits and forefoot plants, that's foot strike. Mid support is from the time the forefoot strikes to the time the heel lifts off the ground. And then toe off is from the time the heel lifts off the ground, the toe lifts off the ground. Follow through in forward recovery phase is three phases. Follow through is when the thigh goes backwards. Forward swing is when the thigh is coming forward. And foot descent is when from that point in time that the thigh has reached the most forward progression, when the foot descends to the ground for the next foot strike. So what I'm going to show you here next is slow motion video of a fairly good woman runner and running in slow motion. And we're going to be looking at her running form so we can understand and this is a slow motion video. And by the way, Dr. Peter Larson has a website called runblogger.com where I got a lot of these videos from. And so if you go on his website, he actually has a lot of these videos offered. So let's look first at this running female, and we're going to stop it. Whoop. Let's go back. We're going to stop it at heel strike for the, come on, come back to life, mouse. This is a tricky, there. Okay. So this is heel strike. This is the beginning of the foot strike phase. just going to do it slow motion here. And she's toeing off, going into forward recovery phase. See the thighs street forward. See the foot hit the ground again. And heel strike. There's foot strike phase, the beginning of the mid support phase. There's the heel lifting off the ground. And there she's toeing off. So you can see this is a fairly probably high level, looks like college age female runner. We have the foot strike, mid support toe off for support phase, and forward recovery. Let's follow through. Thigh comes forward in a forward swing, and then foot descent. So these are the basics of the running gait cycle that when we look at the foot and the lower extremity and the rest of the body, these are how the running gait cycle is typically divided. So when we start talking about running foot strike, we have to understand that we've been looking at this for quite a while. The first actual running study on foot strike pattern was done in 34 years ago by Peter Cavanaugh and Associates in 1980. And what they did, they were actually the first to define this running foot strike pattern. So to do that, they took a group of 17 runners running at about 6-minute mile pace. And what they did, they measured them on a force platform, a force plate, which measures forces. And they divided the shoe sole into the back third, the middle third, and the end of the third. And that, if they struck in this part of the shoe, they were considered rearfoot strikers. If they struck in the middle part, they were considered midfoot strikers. And if they struck in the end of the third of the shoe, they were considered forefoot strikers. The results of that study showed that out of 12 rearfoot strikers, out of the study of 17 people, it was 12 rearfoot strikers, 5 were midfoot strikers, and 0% was forefoot strikers. So you can see in this, and this was at a 6-minute mile pace, you can see in this first study on it that we had about 2/3 of the runners were rearfoot strikers, and only about 1/3 of them were midfoot strikers. None of them were forefoot strikers. One of the things also they found by Peter Cavanaugh and Mario LaFortune, both of who did the study in 1980, is they found something interesting. They found that when people struck on the rear foot, they had what was called an impact peak, which is this peak here in the initial stages of the heel contact. That wasn't present in the midfoot runners. So as you can see, the midfoot runners have more of a smooth curve, so the foot hits the ground, the body comes over the foot, and then leaves the ground here. So this is force and time. You can see, though, in the rearfoot strikers, since the rear foot hits the ground, it has this impact peak that's also called the passive peak. So when we start looking at this idea of foot strike, and we start looking at all the studies, there have now been 8 studies done in the scientific literature on foot strike. Which do runners choose? Do runners choose mostly forefoot striking, or rearfoot striking, or midfoot striking? Just so happens that McKeely, winner of the 2014 Boston Marathon, he's a rearfoot striking runner. He ran a 2:08 rearfoot striking. So obviously, you can be fast and still rearfoot strike. First study done in 1983, out of 753 runners, 81% were rearfoot strikers. Second study done in 2007, these are elite runners, 75% were rearfoot strikers, 24% were midfoot strikers, only 1% forefoot strikers. Out of 936 runners in a half marathon, this was published in 2011, again that's about 89% rearfoot strikers. In a trail race, 165 runners, 85% rearfoot strikers. This is really interesting, out of 903 novice runners, so these are non-competitive novice runners done in 2013, a full 98% of these people were rearfoot strikers. Only a quarter or 0.2% were midfoot strikers, and less than 1% were forefoot strikers. Another study done in 2013, over almost 2,000 runners, 94% were rearfoot strikers, and out of 514 runners, this still impressed, 95% rearfoot strikers, 4% midfoot strikers and about 1% forefoot strikers. So you can see, and this is a graph that I produced out of these 7 studies, is that the blue is rearfoot strikers. The predominant rearfoot strike pattern, the preferred foot strike pattern by the vast majority of runners, over 90% is rearfoot striking. So you can see that this is what people choose to do when they're, and these are races there. This is not even training, this is races that are being filmed. So that tells you they're probably at the higher levels of velocity when you run. Another interesting study done locally, this was done at the Western States run, where they took trail runners and measured rearfoot strike, forefoot strike, and midfoot strike patterns, found that about 80% of the people in the Western States run were rearfoot strikers, and the forefoot strikers were between 0.5% to about 3%. What's interesting, though, in this study is that they took blood levels of what's called CPK, serum creatine phosphokinase, which is a byproduct of muscle breakdown, and found that the runners who were non-rearfoot strikers actually had more breakdown of muscle tissue than the rearfoot strikers. So that implies that possibly running with your forefoot on the ground more than the rear foot could actually damage the tissue. We don't know that, but that's what this study showed. So many authorities, experts say, well, to run fast, you're going to have to run on you're going to have to be on your forefoot. You're going to have to be on your midfoot. Let's look at these elite male leaders from the 2010 Boston Marathon. Now these runners are running at about 450 to 455 mile pace. Okay? And we're going to be looking at the foot strike pattern, and you'll see midfoot striker. This runner here that's a rear foot strike, another rear foot strike, and this is McKeely Z right there, another rear foot striker. So about half of them were midfoot strikers, and half of them were rear foot strikers. So the idea or the notion that rear foot strike, that elite runners don't use their rear foot when they strike is ridiculous, because we see this even at this high level where they're running sub-5-minute mile pace. Many of them still rear foot strike. So and this is showing about half of them are actually landing on their heel. Some of them are landing on the midfoot. So you can see that even elite runners many times are rear foot striking when they run. In fact, how many of you have heard of a baby McKeely? Okay, for those of you who haven't heard of that, baby McKeely is one of the most famous barefoot runners of all time. He actually won the 1960 Rome Olympics running barefoot in a 2:15. But 4 years later, he went on to win the marathon in shoes, ran 7 seconds faster per mile in shoes. But if you look at him run, he's actually rear foot striking. Let's see if we can find a rear foot strike here. Show you right there. So this is in 1964. He's wearing a minimalist shoe, quote unquote. Of course, minimalist shoes we used to call racing flats back in that day, but now they call minimalist shoes. He's going to win the marathon in world record time, 7 seconds faster than running barefoot, but he's heel striking. Again, another elite runner running with a rear foot strike pattern. Steve Prefontaine is probably one of the most famous American distance runners of all time. Shown in the middle here. Here he's doing a training run with 2 other Olympians, Jack Batchelor and Jeff Galloway. And see him obviously rear foot striking. So you can see that the notion that rear foot striking is bad, and even the elite runners are doing it, it seems kind of ridiculous when you have these elite runners who are running at the top level of international competitions still rear foot striking. Okay? So that's something I just want to show, that this is why I think there's a lot of misconception in the running literature, on the internet, and sometimes the running form coaches are saying, well, you shouldn't be landing on your rear foot, you should be landing on your midfoot or forefoot, when over 90% of the runners are doing rear foot striking, elite runners rear foot strike, and maybe that this rear foot striking, midfoot striking, forefoot striking is more of a self-selected thing that we do for other reasons than to go fast or slow. Another series of slow motion videos. This comes from the 2012 Men's Olympic 10K trials. Now these runners are running the fastest. They're running at 425 mile pace. And you look at the variety of strikes. These are the best runners in the United States running a 6.2 mile race. This is at the 2 mile mark. And you can see some of them are running on their midfoot. Some are landing on their rear foot. Some are landing on their heels. I'm landing on the heel. Some are landing just on their forefoot. So there's a wide variety. This guy's a little bit of a rearfoot striker. And then there's one guy that comes up here just pretty soon, and he doesn't even let the heel touch the ground. He's all on his forefoot. He's going to come up here in just a little bit here. Okay, that's a midfoot strike. And you got to remember, these guys are running 430 mile pace. He's more for rearfoot striker. Yeah, some of these guys have their shoes held together by tape.
Yeah.
You can see the drop of water. You can see the. Now this guy, look, he doesn't even touch the heel on the ground. That guy's a midfoot, rear foot. So you can see though, there's a wide variety. Even that fast pace. This is like probably a lot of you could not even run 1 mile at 425 mile pace. These guys are doing 6 miles together, and you can see the wide variety: midfoot, forefoot, rear foot strikers. So the next thing we got to answer is, we now know which foot strike pattern is most predominant. We know that that was the rear foot strike pattern. What foot strike pattern is most efficient? Well, there's been a few studies now where they've actually compared foot strike patterns and had runners run both with a midfoot strike and a rear foot strike to see which is most energy efficient. In other words, for a given pace, which running form allows you to run with the least burn oxygen. In other words, how much oxygen you're burning. That's how they measure. They measure oxygen consumption. First study done on 37 runners. Rearfoot strike runners were more efficient, burned less carbohydrate than the forefoot strikers. This is at slow to medium speeds. And a study of 20 sub-elite distance runners. Rearfoot strikers were approximately 5 to 9% more efficient. So those two studies show that the rearfoot strikers were more efficient at the same pace than someone running midfoot. There's also a computer simulation study. This is done by University of Amherst and Joe Hamill was one of the authors, who's a friend of mine. And rearfoot striking running was shown to be, compared to midfoot striking running, was shown to be more energy efficient in a computer simulation study. So, and this is what they do with this. They actually model the human body to be running both midfoot and rear foot, and just seeing if they can calculate out the energy consumption. Now, this gets us into the area of running form coaching. Two of the most popular running forms that are not only sold by book form but also on the internet, and there are actually coaches that do this, are pose running and chi running. And I'm going to just briefly go through that and talk about these running forms, both of these running forms tend to promote non-rearfoot striking, midfoot striking type running. So let's look at the studies that actually use these. Pose running was actually created by this gentleman, Nicholas Romanoff. He actually has a PhD now, and one of the studies he was involved in, here he is in the study 2005, they took a group of triathletes, excuse me, and measured their oxygen cost of running. They trained some to run in the pose method and some to run just their normal gait. So they actually did a 12-week training period of pose, and this is the pose method. Pose means that he tends to show, okay, this is your pose of how you should run, and that's where the pose name comes from. You can see him showing this runner how he should be running to be the best runner, at least in his opinion. Well, unfortunately, what they found in the study, and with Dr. Romanoff being part of the study, that his method actually caused decreased efficiency. Caused 7.6% increase in oxygen consumption compared to the runners who just ran in their regular running form. So you can see they tried to change these people running form for 12 time and actually made them less efficient metabolically. Okay. So this is some evidence showing that maybe we shouldn't be messing with running form if you're a rearfoot striker or midfoot striker or forefoot striker. Maybe our body is already finding the most efficient form for us to run without having a running coach or an expert showing us how to run better. Probably I'm going to turn, I don't have this on, let me see if I can turn this up so you guys can hear it.
Don't ever sit past your head.
Can you hear that?
Every time my foot lands, when I'm running, every time my foot lands in the support phase of my stride, it means that my foot is underneath me. And sometimes it's even a little behind my center mass. Okay? I don't want my foot to land in front of my hips, ever. If it lands in front of my hips, it's in front of my center mass. So the main ruling idea you want to keep inside your head is to never let your feet get ahead of your hips. Don't let your feet land, hit the ground in front of your hips.
So this is Danny Dreyer. Danny Dreyer is the inventor and co-founder of this chi running. Chi running has a book, has a website, has coaches, and you can hear, this is back in 2009 when he first started teaching this. He's teaching runners that you should never let your feet get ahead of your hips. And I have heard this in running classes before, that you should land with your foot underneath your hip. And this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Okay, I've been running for 40 years, and everyone hits with their feet in front of their hips. Okay, but he's telling you shouldn't do that. So let's look at this. Now, he did make a book, Chi Running, and this is Danny Dreyer running on his cover. Let's find his hip, and let's find his foot. Where is his foot relative to his hip?
Ahead.
On the cover of his book, his foot is ahead of his hips. But he's telling you, never let your feet get ahead of your hips. There's a credibility issue here, is that he's telling you to do something that maybe he doesn't know he's doing it, but runners do this. This is how you run. As a matter of fact, here's Danny Dreyer leading a group of runners. Now, I don't know if that's really running. That's about a 4 mile per hour pace, so that's about a fast walk. So I guess if you're running in place, you do land with your feet in front of your hips, or under your hips, but not when you're going forward. Here's another pictures. College runners, feet in front of the hips, 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 feet in front of the hips. Here's a boy, 6-year-old boy from Dr. Larson's website. I think it's his son. He's a natural runner. He hasn't been coached on how to run. How does he run? Feet in front of the hips. How does McKeely run? Feet in front of the hips. Do you see what I'm saying? The faster you go, typically the farther your feet will be out in front of you. So if you have a coach telling you that you should be running with your feet under your hips, you'll say, well, that's not possible. And why is that not possible? Because you would fall forward if you did it. I'll show you a picture of it. So here's some other runners. Feet in front of the hips. This is a 5K, again, from Peter Larson's website. There's a 3 mile mark of a road race, 300 frames a second. You can see that all of them are landing with their feet in front of their hips, well in front of their hips. In fact, I would like to see someone try to run with their feet not in front of their hips. That would be nearly impossible. Okay? But you see, this whole genre of running form like chi running and pose running is telling you can run the way they're teaching you in their books and other websites, but they're not showing that, they're not any evidence to show that that's the right form. So why would a runner want to run with their feet in front of the hips? In other words, it makes sense. It's kind of intuitive to say, okay, let's not run with the feet in front of the hips because that's going to slow you down, because it's going to break you. Well, what happens in running, though, we need to have braking forces in the first part of the stance of support phase, and we need to then propel as we go forward. And the reason we need to do that because that's the way the human bipedal animal runs. He runs with braking in the first part of the support phase, and then propulsion in the last step. In other words, when the foot's in front of me, I'm braking. As soon as the center of my mass gets over my foot, it transitions to a propulsion force. Okay? And we can see this in these pictures. Here's ground reaction force. This is the braking force in the first half, and here's the propulsion force. Here's what the ground reaction force does. In heel striking running, it first hits the ground, the force is tilted backwards toward the back, and then at the midway point, it points forward and pushes us forward. And here's a forefoot striker doing the same thing. Braking, then propulsion. So here's a nice little slow motion video showing this idea. And this is actually the ground reaction force vector. In other words, this is the vector of force coming off the force plate in a rear foot striking runner. You see how it's initially, when he hits the ground initially, it points backwards. It's actually always going through his hip. You see how that arrow is always going through the guy's hip? It pretty much follows the hip. So when the hip's behind the foot, the ground reaction force is going backwards. And then as we go forward, it pushes forward. Now here's more of a midfoot striker. Same thing. And this graph actually shows the posterior braking force and the anterior pushing force. Okay. You can see though, they're always, every time you hit, you're braking initially, then you're pushing off. Now, you're not going to see this too often, someone running 25 miles an hour. This is actually a national class sprinter runner. He's an NCAA All-American sprinter running at 25 miles per hour. Now, anyway, you've ridden a bike at 25 miles an hour, how fast that is? This guy's running that fast on a treadmill. Even at that speed, you can see the foot's hanging in front of it. The foot is landing in front of the hip. And there's actually a brake force, and then a propulsion force. But look at the ground reaction force vector. You see the magnitude? This is pounds of force. This guy's about 185 pounds. He's hitting the ground with 850 pounds of force. When you're going that fast, you've got to generate a lot of force to go that fast. So you can see that not only is he landing with his foot in front of the hip, he's also generating a huge amount of force to be able to go 25 miles an hour on a treadmill. And this is about Usain Bolt speed, but in a treadmill, you don't have the wind blowing against you, see? So when you're running 25 miles an hour, if you could do that, you'd be fighting 25-mile headwind. On a treadmill, you have the advantage of not having the headwind to fight against. So why do runners brake when they run? Why do they have to put their foot in front of the center mat? Because we have to balance the force coming from the ground through our hip. We want our force to go backwards through the hip when we first land, and it's going to follow our hip all the way through so that we can push off. Because what's going to happen is that this force, of this ground reaction force, is not going through our hip and balancing the forces. We're going to have a problem. And the problem is going to be, just imagine, what I did is I photoshopped Meb's leg. I took it from the top photo. You see how I kind of transposed it so he's underneath the hip? Now just imagine if that ground force was going backwards again, what would Meb do? You want to see that again? I worked an hour on that. I want to show you at least a few times. So what is Meb going to do? Meb is going to fall forward because he's being pushed, the ground is pushing his legs this way, and he's going to flip forward because he's not balanced. So that's why we choose, our central nervous system chooses to balance ourselves during running so that the force from the ground is always going through our center of mass, which is about above our hips. And that's the way we maintain balance. But the real reason we do this, putting our foot in front of our center of mass, in front of our hips, is because running is like being on a pogo stick. And what I mean by that is that the way we run is when we first hit, we store energy in our leg spring, and then the second part, we release the energy to push ourselves forward. Here's a graph, here's a kind of a model of that. So we hit the ground in running, our knees bend, we store energy in our legs, our foot is ahead of us to start, we bend our knees, storing energy, and then as our body comes forward, we push off and release the energy so we can go forward to the next step. In a very similar way, a little boy on a pogo stick can go forward in a pogo stick, stores energy when he hits, and then he leans forward and goes forward. Okay. So this spring mass model, this is called the spring mass model. The spring mass model is actually the most commonly used model for biomechanics and biomechanics of running and the interjection running, explaining how we transfer energy from step to step to go faster, and why we can go faster running than we can walk. So the spring mass model predicts that we have to first compress our leg spring, just like a shock absorber. We have to first compress the leg spring to store the energy, just like you would compress a spring to first make it go, and that's in front of our foot's planted in front. We store the energy, and as we move forward, we want to release to push us onto the next foot strike. So initially, we want to brake, store leg energy in our spring, come to the middle of our body over the foot, our body center of mass of our foot. Then as we go forward, then we want to be pushing forward to the next step. And this is how we run as a bipedal, or in other words, two-footed animal. Now, when you start getting into horses and dogs and cats and they're running, it's a quadrupedal gait. So they have different mechanics. But when you're running like we do as humans, there's only certain ways we can do that and still maintain balance and go forward in an efficient manner. So in other words, the foot has to be placed ahead of the center of mass. In other words, in front of the hips when we're running, in order that the leg spring can compress, store the energy, so that we can propel ourselves forward for the next step. If we were to try to run like some of the running coaches tell us to do by putting our feet under the center of mass or under the hip, we would fall forward. So what you'll see is every runner will have their foot in front of their hip when they run, if they run properly. But if you run really slow, you can have your foot almost underneath your center of mass. If you're running like 2 miles an hour, yeah, it can be there because you're really not going, it's not really running. It's more of a shuffle. But as we start getting into 10-minute mile pace and 9-minute mile pace, 8-minute mile pace, 7-minute mile pace, we start getting faster, we got to take longer steps just to get the running velocity going. So what are other factors that can change a heel strike? Well, one of the most common things we see, and this has been present with the minimalist shoe fad that we had a few years ago with the Vibram 5 fingers and such, is that when you change what's called the heel drop. And a heel drop is defined as the difference in height between the rear foot and the forefoot of the shoe. That if we have a rear foot thickness and forefoot thickness shoe that's the same, that's called a zero drop or a zero heel drop shoe. If though, like in this shoe, the Saucony Guide, if the rear foot is thicker by 12 millimeters than the forefoot, then that's going to be called a 12 millimeter drop shoe. And that will affect the foot strike because the lower the heel drop, such as in the Vibram 5 finger shown here on the upper right, it's going to tend to promote more midfoot or forefoot striking. But as you raise the heel of the shoe, such as in the Saucony Guide, we're going to promote more rear foot striking. And this is actually Peter Larson actually running in his Vibram 5 finger shoes, his Nike Free shoes on the left here on the bottom. It's a 4 millimeter drop. And also the Saucony Guide. You can see how in slow motion here, how the foot strike actually changes as he changes shoe. He's running about the same speed, but you can see how his foot strike actually changes. His brain's telling, okay, I want to hit this way in this shoe, this way in this shoe. Now I'm assuming he's not trying to change the foot strike pattern on purpose for the video. This is the way his body is selected to run in these shoes. So in general, the taller the heel height, the more the heel drop, the more you're going to be a heel first, rear foot striker. The lower the heel of the shoe, the less the heel drop, you're going to be more of a midfoot, forefoot striker. What other things cause a difference in foot strike pattern? Most of you all have watched runners. You know that when you see a sprinter, you don't see them run on their heels. They run on the forefoot. As we run faster and faster, we're going to tend to go away from being a rear foot striker to being more of a midfoot striker than a forefoot striker. Okay? Here's a study done actually just this year, 2014, just published. I just got the journal in my inbox about a week ago. And this is showing that they took 55 recreational competitive runners, studied the 4 running speeds, and what they showed is that as we got more and more runners, as we got faster and faster, they had fewer rear foot strikers and more midfoot and forefoot strikers. So this study shows that for these 55 runners, both recreational and competitive, as they were asked to run faster and faster, many of them went from rear foot to midfoot to forefoot striking. Now some of them didn't change so much also. In fact, 52% of the runners kept the same foot strike pattern even though they changed speed. So some people change their running strike pattern more than others. We don't really know why, but that's what we're seeing in the research. Another study done, this is earlier, 1996, showing 23 runners, that what we see is that here's the forefoot striking bars, rear foot striking bars, and midfoot striking bars. We see as we get into the faster running speeds toward the right here, higher percentage of the runners are forefoot strikers, fewer rearfoot strikers, but of the slower running speeds, almost everyone's a rearfoot striker. So again, another study showing that as we run slower, we tend to be more of a rearfoot striker. As we run faster, we're going to tend to go more in our midfoot and forefoot, and it tends to vary. It's not, we can't say everyone does the same, but they tend to show that pattern. One other thing that's interesting, and like I told you about the guy running 25 miles an hour on the treadmill, 800 pounds of force, that's a huge amount. That's probably 4 times his body weight. What they found was they did a study which is really interesting. They took track athletes, 33 track athletes of varying ability, and measured the force underneath their foot when they ran at their peak, the fastest time they could run. And what they found was that the way that the runners ran faster was not by moving their legs faster off the ground, but actually by generating more force underneath their foot. So what we're seeing is that when you run slower, you generate less force. You hit the ground less hard. As you run faster and faster, you get more force, and you can see. And so if you're a faster runner, sometimes that's the difference of being able to generate more force per unit time than the guy who you're passing. Okay? So the ability to generate force is very important. Of course, more force produces what? Maybe more injuries. And that's why we often see people who've bumped up their training for a race, doing more intervals, doing more fartlek training, where you're running kind of varied speeds, is that they can get more injuries because as you run faster, you generate more force between the foot and the ground. So another thing we want to talk about is that idea that, and I think this is something that's promoted, is that forefoot striking or midfoot striking is somehow more natural than being a rearfoot striker. And this probably all came out this 2010 study by Lieberman and co-workers. Lieberman, Dan Lieberman, was a kind of a polarizing figure in the barefoot minimalist controversy because his lab at Harvard was promoting barefoot running. And so what they found was that in habitually barefoot Kenyan runners that ran with a forefoot striking pattern, that they had reduced impact forces. And so Lieberman and company made the following quote: forefoot and midfoot striking gaits were probably more common when humans ran barefoot or in minimal shoes, and may protect the feet and lower limbs from some of the impact-related injuries now experienced by a high percentage of runners. Okay. So he's suggesting that this forefoot striking pattern is not only natural, but is the reason maybe our ancestors weren't as injured as much. What's real interesting in 2013, so 3 years later, Kevin Hatala and his co-workers actually took another group of Kenyan runners, but they ran them instead at, now you gotta remember Lieberman, let me go back to Lieberman's slide, they had Lieberman running at 4:52 mile pace. Hatala took another group of Kenyans, but had them run at more of an 8-minute mile pace. So 8-minute mile pace is more what we're gonna see a typical marathoner run versus a 5-minute mile pace, right? And what he found was that 73% of these barefoot Kenyans preferred to run on the rear foot. So in other words, this is running speed dependent. So he went and ran them at 8-minute mile pace, found 73% of barefoot Kenyans were rear foot strikers, only 24% were midfoot strikers, and 4% were forefoot strikers. So the idea that barefoot runners, our ancestors, were running on their forefoot or midfoot, obviously, unless they were running, being chased by a tiger or something, or running after someone to kill them with a spear or playing a game, but if they're just going a long distance at 8-minute mile pace, they're probably running on the rear foot. So who's to say what's more natural? In fact, the notion that Lieberman promoted with his study, saying that midfoot or forefoot striking is more natural, in my estimation, is pure speculation and has no scientific basis within the literature today. So we have to start to look at this idea that, well, maybe there's, all the people are talking about rearfoot striking being bad, rearfoot striking causing injury. Let's look at the scientific research. And I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly, and this research is out there, but let's just take a few of the key studies that have been shown on this. This study done in 2003 shown that forefoot striking produced increased peak ground reaction force, vertical loading rate, VLR is vertical loading, means the loading of the tibia, and tibial acceleration, increased pronation of the rear foot, increased ground reaction force going through the foot in the forward backward direction, also increased knee stiffness and decreased ankle stiffness. Again, here's another study. This was done on 20 female runners. And what they did, they measured what's called the peak tibial acceleration. Many times to measure peak tibial acceleration, they'll take an accelerometer. And you guys that have iPhones and such, there's accelerometers in your little devices. They have a little accelerometer they put on the tibia and measure how fast it decelerates during running. What they found was that the rearfoot strikers, non-rearfoot strikers, decreased their peak tibial acceleration from 9.5 to 13.2 in rearfoot striking. So actually, their conclusion of these authors was that it is not advantageous for rearfoot strikers to transition from non-rearfoot striking if peak tibial acceleration is the criteria measure. In other words, these researchers are looking at the idea that we should be changing the running form because of rearfoot strikers or forefoot strikers, thinking that that's beneficial. And these researchers are obviously showing, well, I don't know if that's a good idea. Another study done when they took natural rearfoot strikers and natural forefoot strikers and tried to switch them either to take the forefoot striker, switch them to a rearfoot strike pattern, and a rearfoot strike pattern into a forefoot strike pattern and see what happened. And their conclusion was that the joint moments at the knee, in other words, the rotational forces at the knee were greater in the rearfoot strikers, but in the ankle, the forefoot strikers had the greater forces. And this is kind of what we're seeing in the research, is that the knee seems to be having more load going through it in the rearfoot striking, but in the ankle, the forefoot striking produces more load. So it may be that the people with knee injuries are the ones that we may want to shift into more of a forefoot midfoot strike pattern, and people who are having ankle problems like Achilles tendonitis or tendonitis of the peroneals or postertibial may be ones we want to shift back to rearfoot. Question?
I was just thinking that the greater force, meaning more impact on that joint, which, like you were just saying, if you have an ankle injury, you don't want to be landing on your forefoot because that absorbs the impact in your
that's
ankle.
Great comment. Yeah, what we're seeing in the literature is that maybe if we're going to be trying to get people to retrain, we got to know first of all where they're getting injured, and not just shift everyone into one set. Because if you're in knee injuries, maybe it's okay to shift more of the midfoot or forefoot. But if you're getting more of an ankle injury pattern, definitely you don't want to do that, because the rearfoot striking seems to be have less forces going through. In fact, these researchers made the comment that switching techniques may have different injury implications given the altered distribution and loading between the joints, but should be weighed against the overall effects. So in other words, you've got to weigh, should we be gait retraining people when they're not injured? I mean, just because they're running the rear foot, when 90% of the people are running rear foot, why would you want to change that if the people are running fine? It doesn't make any sense to me. Another study showing they had 19 experienced runners, and one of the difference is that again, the forefoot strike pattern caused no initial peak, caused an increase in ground reaction force in the active peak, but the forefoot strike pattern altered the knee moments to the extent that the authors concluded that the forefoot strike pattern seems to be more risky regarding development of patellofemoral pain syndrome than rearfoot striking. So, in this study, they actually thought that the rearfoot striking was going to cause less patellofemoral pain. But this is just one study. This is the only study I've seen comment on that. So you can see there's still a lot of controversy on this. And another nice study was done actually just recently, and this again was by Peter Larson, the same guy that does a Run Blogger. And this is Frank Shorter. He won the Olympic marathon in 1972. And this study looked at barefoot and minimalist runners. And what they found in this race, where it was a barefoot run in New York City, is that even though 59% of them were forefoot strikers, which typically we think of barefoot runners being forefoot strikers, a full 20% of them were rearfoot strikers. So you can see, even in people who are experienced barefoot runners, and this is running on asphalt, some of them still were rearfoot striking. So you can see there's a lot of diversity. And the question is, is should we be telling them to run differently, or is this the way they're running because this is the most comfortable for them? So the foot strikes do differ between the barefoot minless runners, minless shoe runners, obviously more of them are rear foot strikers. And so, but when we are running in minless shoes or barefoot, we're going to tend to be less of a rear foot striker, more of a forefoot midfoot striker. And this goes back to your comment on loading, is that this study looked at 50 rear foot striker runners, 50 forefoot striker runners. This was done in 2013 by Rooney et al. Showed that increased loading the ankle joint for forefoot striking is an area of concern for individuals considering altering their foot strike pattern. So again, we're seeing that the contact forces of the ankle are increased in forefoot striking and running. The plantar flexor muscles, in other words, calf muscles, are under more force when you forefoot strike, whereas when you rear foot strike, the knee tends to be under more load. And again, another study showing the same thing. This is done in 2013 by Kumala et al. Basically saying, again, we have rear foot strikers and forefoot strikers. These are all female runners. Forefoot striking, they lower their patellofemoral force. In other words, the force between the kneecap and the femur was less when they forefoot struck, and the forefoot strikers had higher ankle plantar flexion moment. In other words, the calf muscles are working harder for the forefoot striker. So you can't just change your running form and expect all the forces to go away. They go to another part. When you're landing on your forefoot, you put more strain on your calf, more strain on your ankle. Yeah, you may take some load off your knee, but then if you start running your rear foot, you put maybe a little more load on your knee, but you take load off your calf muscle and your load off your ankle. So you can see that it's a zero-sum game. In other words, you take from one place, you add it to another, you take load off another place, put on another, so we just can't say there's one best running form, and that we sometimes have to just pick to see what's most comfortable for us as runners. And for me, as a doctor who treats runners, I've got to be cognizant of these patterns, watch a person run, see where their injuries are, so I can give the best advice of whether they should be trying to change form, or we should just be doing something like getting them heel lifts, or getting them to like a shoe with a lower heel drop or higher heel drop, or what have you. A few more, we're almost done here. We're going to just talk about this last one, these last studies, and this talks about the runners, 30 competitive runners. Again, recent study, a lot of this research has come out in the last 5 years, 2014 study, where they looked at vertical load rate for rear foot strikers and forefoot strikers, and their conclusion from their study was transitioning from rear foot strike to forefoot strike in traditional running shoes may not offer long-term protection against impact-related running injuries. So again, we're seeing that a lot of these researchers are now saying, hold on, let's not change people's form. Let's look at the scientific data first before we start making wholesale changes, because there can be some serious injury implications from doing that. Another study, again, 2013, and rear foot striking was found to be more comfortable than forefoot striking, and also forefoot striking did have less peak leg impact. So there are some benefits to each forefoot strike pattern. One of the things that is often promoted in the running literature and in the running classes is that rear foot striking is thought to be bad because it causes more injuries. Well, what does the literature say about that? There's about 3 or 4 different studies on that. First study was done in 2003 in German literature, 471 runners, no difference in injury rates between rear foot strikers and forefoot strikers. So this is a prospective study where that's the highest level of study we can do, is we take 2 groups, measure them over a period of time, and we found that there's no difference in injuries. Second study, again, much larger, 1,203, again in the German literature, showed that there's no difference in injury rates between rear foot strikers and forefoot strikers. So they're both getting injured. We know that. We know the forefoot strikers are going to get Achilles tendonitis more. Rear foot strikers may come in more with knee pain. Yeah, but they're still getting injured. It's just different locations. Again, recent study. This is just presented as an abstract at the American College of Sports Medicine meeting this year. Studied over 1,000 runners here in America. Found that there's no difference in injury rates between rear foot strikers and non-rear foot strikers. So again, 3 big studies. We're looking at over probably about 2,500 runners here or more, 2,600 runners, seeing that all 3 studies show there's no difference in injury rates between those. In fact, the whole idea, and I think this all gets back to remember the slide where I showed you the impact peak for rear foot strikers? Is that the impact peak, you only see that with the rear foot strikers, you don't see that with the midfoot strikers, and I think it all comes back to that. thinking that this little blip on the ground interaction force curve is the cause of these injuries. Well, is this little impact peak really the cause? Well, so far we don't really see that because we know that use of shock absorbent insoles don't reduce stress fractures. Running on hard surfaces don't increase injuries when compared to running on soft surfaces. And also the incidence of osteoarthritis in the body, legs, feet, what have you, occurs in equal frequency of the runners and non-runners. So is that really good evidence that these impact forces cause injury? Well, no, not really. In fact, probably the world's leading authority on running injuries, Ben Onig, and I just lectured with Dr. Nig in Los Angeles in June, is that from his most recent book, and this is actually a really good book, Biomechanics Sports Shoes, published in 2010, he says currently there's no conclusive evidence that impact forces during the heel-to-toe running are responsible for development of running-related injuries. And he quotes out of this study from 1996 that impact forces are not good candidates as factors responsible for running or general sports-related injuries. It's been shown that exposure, time, and previous injuries are the best predictors of movement-related injuries. So forget about the impact and that little impact peak, I say. Look at more what Dr. Nig is saying, is that we're looking at people, what has your injury pattern been? How much are you running? Are you increasing your mileage rapidly? These are probably more predictors of whether you're going to be injured or not than whether you have a heel foot striker or not. In fact, the study that he did back in 1997 showed that the running injuries, people that had higher loading rates and had higher impact peaks were actually less likely to get injured than people that had lower impact. So, you can't, it really doesn't make a lot of sense that these impact forces are the cause of the injuries. So things like joint movements, forces, rotational forces going through the legs could be a cause of the injuries also. With all that in mind, there are two studies now that show there may be some hope in using the forefoot strike pattern running versus rear foot strike pattern running for one specific condition. Now the condition is called anterior chronic exertional compartment syndrome. And that's where runners will develop a tightening of the leg group here in the calf. It can cause swelling of the muscle. It can cause increased pressure. It can actually cause pain. You can get numbness, and even if it's real bad, you can lose circulation. So these runners basically will run after 5 or 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and they got to stop because of pain so bad. Devo et al. Actually has done 2 studies now where they actually took these runners and took them from being a rear foot striker to more of a forefoot striker and actually got them to resolve that condition. So for this one condition, this is one, and this is what I'm doing now with my patients. I don't see that many. I probably see 3 or 4 a year. But for those runners, we're trying to use their technique and to see if that works. I can't tell you right now it's working, but certainly this is something to consider for this one injury, that trying to retrain people from rear foot striker to forefoot striker is maybe the way to go if they have this anterior chronic exertional compartment syndrome. So, in summary of the research on rear-foot strike pattern, what does it say? Well, rear foot, midfoot, and forefoot striking is defined simply by which third of the shoe. If it's in the back third of the shoe, they're a rear foot striker. Front third of the shoe, it's a forefoot striker. Middle third, they're considered midfoot strikers. As I've shown you before, rear foot striking is by far over 90%. This is the preferred foot strike pattern of the vast majority of runners. We've studied now over 5,000 runners, probably close to 6,000 by now, and over 90% are rear foot strikers. The idea that the foot should be planted under the hip is ridiculous. Every runner that I've seen videotape of, they're always landing. The only reason that you would be landing with your foot under your hip is if you're running in place. 0 speed. If you're running, you've got to be putting your foot in front of you so you can brake, absorb the energy, release the energy, and move forward at the pace you want to run. Rear foot striking, in every single study I've seen, there's been 3 or 4 studies now, rear foot striking is more economical than forefoot striking for slower running to medium running speeds. Now, we don't know, though, for faster running speeds, forefoot striking may be more economical for faster running speeds, but that hasn't been studied yet. Rearfoot striking, in my estimation, is just as natural as midfoot forefoot striking because we have a study of Kenyans showing that when they asked to run at a 8-minute mile pace, a lot of them were rearfoot striking. So it's not the forefoot striking. The one that showed forefoot striking was preferred was run at 5-minute mile pace. So of course, I told you, as you run faster, you're going to run on your forefoot. Regardless of whether you have a rear foot, forefoot, or midfoot strike, you're going to have the same rate of injury. The difference is the location. You're a forefoot striker, you're probably going to be more of a metatarsal pain, maybe a metatarsal stress fracture, ankle injuries, like Achilles tendonitis, or peroneal tendonitis, or posterior tibial tendonitis. If rearfoot striker, they seem like they're getting more knee injuries. So we're still at the infancy of learning about this, but certainly this makes sense that changing your foot strike pattern changes the injury patterns, not so much the injury rates.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Is it possible to have a different foot strike for each foot?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, you can have actually a different foot. That's a good question. You can actually have a different foot strike pattern for each foot. It's typically not a huge difference between the two, but if you were to, if I was to show you the Boston Marathon pictures again, there's actually a few of the runners that one was landing on the heel on one foot and landing on midfoot on the other. So, and actually the lady runner, the very first slow motion video I showed you, the lady running in the woods, she actually has one foot that hits with a rear foot strike and one hits with a midfoot strike.
Well, looking at based on the wear and tear of my shoes, I
Right.
have the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually fairly common. I think in the studies that I've read, it's estimated that about 5 to 10% of runners they studied actually had a different strike pattern. Yeah, so interesting. And then finally, the last point is that as a sports podiatrist for 29 years, so I've actually been out of podiatrist school for 31 years, and a runner for 40 years, and my review of the running literature is that I don't think that runners should just change your foot strike pattern just because someone told you to, unless there's a good reason. Are you injured? Maybe. You want to run faster? No. You want to change shoes? Yeah, I mean, you change your shoes, you are going to change your foot strike pattern. You go to a minimalist shoe, low heel shoe, or racing flat, you may be more of a forward midfoot striker. That's okay. But don't just change it because you read on the internet that rear foot striking is bad, like some of these websites are saying rear foot striking, you shouldn't run with your heel hit. That's ridiculous because we see so many people being injured now who have been taught by running coaches to not run on the rear foot, run on their forefoot. They come in and they all of a sudden got an injury they never had before. So don't do it. Resist the temptation. If you're a rear foot striker, don't worry about it. 90% of runners are rear foot strikers, and they are not getting injured any more than the forefoot or midfoot strikers. With that in mind, I'm going to show you one of my favorite videos. This is Dave Waddle. Dave Waddle, 800-meter runner. Last lap of the 100-meter final, 1972 Munich Olympics. He starts in the back. There's Dave Waddle with his hat on. American runner. Starting in the back. He's in the final lap.
There's Arzana from the Soviet Union going up to the lead now. There goes Arzana, the favorite, taking the lead. Dave Waddle is making his bid. He's in too bad position right now. I think Dave's in great position on this. At this point, he's in perfect position on the outside. Good striking distance for this last 200 meters. Stand by for the kick of Dave Waddle. If he's got it, he could make it. But he's got to catch Arzana and the Kenyans. And here he goes. This is the bid for a gold medal of Dave Waddle. He's got one Kenyan. I think he's going to get it, make it. I think he's going to
Wow.
Now, why did I show you that? Because I was 15 years old when that happened, and after I watched him and Frank Shorter win the gold medal, Dave Waddle and Frank Shorter won the gold medal. I was 15. I was a high school runner here in Sacramento, and I got all excited about running and changed from being a basketball, baseball, football player to a runner. And it's, you know, things like this that inspires kids to do what we did. And here I am now, been running for 40 years, sports podiatrist, and this was one of the most inspiring things I saw. And this is why I'm here. I'm here to try to give you some objective information on things that are important to me and also my patients and other runners, so you guys can have more fun running, be less injured, and enjoy your sport more. So thank you very much, and thanks for being a good audience.